Joshua, son of Nun, was not an ordinary man. He had been Moses' assistant for many years and had witnessed incredible miracles firsthand, including the parting of the Red Sea and the giving of the 10 Commandments. Joshua was from the tribe of Ephraim, one of the 12 tribes of Israel, and had proven himself a courageous warrior, especially when he scouted the land of Canaan 40 years earlier. Numbers chapter 13. Now, with Moses gone, God personally called Joshua to take on the responsibility of leading the Israelites into the land that had been promised to their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, generations before. This land, known as the Promised Land, was Canaan, a fertile region where Israel would establish itself as a nation. The Promised Land wasn't just any land. It was a place specifically chosen by God for his people. It represented the fulfillment of a covenant made long ago, a land flowing with milk and honey, symbolizing abundance, prosperity, and peace. Exodus chapter 3, verse 17. For over 400 years, the Israelites had waited for this moment. The journey to Canaan was not just a physical journey, but also a spiritual one, marking the transformation of a wandering group of ex-slaves into a nation under God's guidance. However, the land was not empty. It was inhabited by powerful nations, and Joshua would need to lead Israel into battle to claim it. If you enjoy this type of story, I'd like to ask you to leave a like on this video. By doing so, you'll be helping us. May God bless you. God's call to Joshua came after Moses' death. In a direct and personal way, God spoke to Joshua saying, "Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people, get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I'm about to give to them, to the Israelites." Joshua chapter 1 verse 2. This was no small task. The Jordan River was a significant physical barrier, and beyond it lay a land filled with enemies. Yet God reassured Joshua with one of the most profound promises in the Bible. "As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you." Joshua chapter 1 verse 5. This was the moment that would define Joshua's leadership, a moment where he had to step into Moses' shoes and led a people still grieving the loss of their previous leader. Joshua wasn't chosen randomly. His loyalty, faith, and strength had been evident throughout the years of wandering in the desert. Unlike the other spies sent to scout Canaan, Joshua, along with Caleb, had trusted in God's power to give Israel victory over the land's inhabitants, even when others were afraid. This faith, along with his humility and willingness to serve under Moses, made him the perfect leader to take Israel into the Promised Land. Joshua's role was not just about military conquests, it was about continuing the spiritual journey of Israel as a people of faith. In this calling, Joshua was given a divine command: "Be strong and courageous." Joshua chapter 1 verse 9. This wasn't just an encouragement, it was a directive from God. Joshua knew that the challenges ahead would be great, not only in battle, but in keeping the faith of the Israelites strong. The journey ahead was filled with uncertainty, but God's promise to be with Joshua, just as he had been with Moses, gave him the courage to lead. Joshua had to trust in God's guidance every step of the way, knowing that the future of Israel rested on his shoulders. The Jordan River was no small obstacle. At the time Joshua and the Israelites approached it, the river was at flood stage, Joshua chapter 3 verse 15, making the crossing even more treacherous. Normally, the river spans about 30 meters in width, but during its annual flooding, it swells dramatically, sometimes reaching up to 100 meters wide. The water, rushing with force from the surrounding hills and mountains, made it seem impossible for an entire nation with their families, livestock, and belongings to cross. According to archaeological findings, the Jordan Valley was a steep-walled trench, which would have made the passage even more daunting. The idea of fording this river, swollen with springtime rains, must have filled the people with anxiety. In addition to its width, The Jordan River's depth during the flood season could have reached over 3 meters in some places. This wasn't a gentle stream. It was a powerful torrent of water, cutting through the landscape and making safe passage seem unlikely. This natural barrier separated the Israelites from the Promised Land, and there were no bridges or boats to assist them in crossing. The river itself became a symbol of the seemingly insurmountable challenges that lay ahead in their conquest of Canaan. However, this daunting physical barrier was about to become a testimony to the power of God. Joshua, fully trusting in God's promise, led the people with unwavering faith. Archaeologists have studied the natural conditions of the Jordan River, suggesting that sudden blockages upstream, such as landslides, might occasionally halt the river's flow for a time. However, the timing and precision of the river's parting, when the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant stepped into the water, Joshua chapter 3, verses 15 to 17, was nothing short of miraculous. The moment the priests' feet touched the water, the river halted and the water upstream stood in a heap, leaving dry ground for the entire nation to cross. This was not a coincidence, but a divine act, perfectly orchestrated to prove that God was with his people. It's also significant that the Ark of the Covenant was at the forefront of this crossing. The presence of the Ark, which symbolized God's presence, was the key to their success. As the priests carrying the Ark stood firm in the middle of the riverbed, the entire nation passed by safely. Archaeological studies have shown that the terrain around the Jordan River is rugged, with steep banks and slippery rocks. For the Israelites, including families with children, livestock, and all their belongings, crossing such terrain without the intervention of God would have been nearly impossible. The fact that the river became dry ground under their feet was a testament to the miraculous nature of this event. The Jordan River had long been seen as a natural boundary between the wilderness and the land of Canaan. By crossing it, the Israelites were not just physically entering the Promised Land, they were taking their first step in fulfilling the promise God had made to Abraham generations before. This crossing was a spiritual marker for the nation of Israel, signaling a new chapter in their journey. The difficulty of the river crossing served to highlight God's power and faithfulness, reinforcing that their journey was not accomplished by human strength, but by divine intervention. This miracle became a foundational moment in Israel's history. After crossing the Jordan, Joshua instructed one man from each of the 12 tribes to collect a stone from the riverbed. These 12 stones were used to build a memorial to commemorate the event, Joshua chapter 4, verses 1-9. This memorial was not just a reminder of God's power in parting the waters. It was a sign to future generations that the God who delivered Israel from Egypt was the same God who led them into the Promised Land. The river, once a symbol of the barrier between them and their destiny, became a symbol of God's faithfulness in fulfilling his promises. Inside the ark were 3 sacred items, each filled with deep spiritual significance. The first item was the stone tablets of the law, which held the 10 commandments written by the very finger of God. These tablets represented God's covenant with Israel, a reminder of the laws they were to obey and the unbreakable bond between God and his people. Deuteronomy chapter 10 verse 5. The commandments weren't just rules, but a foundation of Israel's moral and spiritual life, symbolizing their obligation to live according to God's word in order to remain in his favor. The second item was a golden jar containing a portion of manna, the miraculous bread that God provided for Israel during their 40-year journey through the wilderness. Exodus chapter 16, verse 33. This manna came from heaven daily, except on the Sabbath, to sustain the people. The jar of manna was kept as a reminder of God's provision and faithfulness, showing how he nourished them, even in the most difficult times, giving them what they needed to survive. The final item inside the ark was Aaron's rod that miraculously budded. This rod held great meaning, as it was the sign God used to confirm Aaron's selection as high priest. Numbers chapter 17, verse 10. It was more than just a piece of wood. When it budded and produced almonds, it became a living symbol of divine authority given to Aaron and his descendants in their priestly role. It also represented the Levites' special calling to serve in the tabernacle and maintain the sacred duties of worship. God instructed Moses to build the ark with precise care, as it was not merely a sacred object, but the central point of his presence among the people. The lid of the ark, known as the mercy seat, was where the glory of the Lord would manifest, making it God's earthly throne. Only the high priest could approach the ark, and only once a year on the Day of Atonement, to make sacrifices for the sins of Israel. Leviticus chapter 16, verse 34. This restriction highlighted God's holiness and mankind's sinful nature, reminding them of the need for atonement. God's presence was so powerful that anyone who touched the ark in an improper way would be immediately punished. A striking example of this occurred with Uzzah, who reached out to steady the ark when the oxen stumbled. He was struck dead on the spot by God's judgment. 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 7. This act reinforced the absolute reverence and respect required when dealing with the ark, emphasizing the holiness of God and the importance of obedience to his commands. After the miraculous crossing of the Jordan River, Joshua received a special command from God. He was instructed to have one man from each of the 12 tribes of Israel take a stone from the riverbed, where the priests stood with the Ark of the Covenant. Joshua chapter 4, verses 2-3. These 12 stones were to be set up as a memorial on the west side of the Jordan, at a place called Gilgal. This was not just a random act, but a deliberate and symbolic gesture to remind future generations of God's faithfulness and power in bringing Israel into the Promised Land. The stones served as a visible and lasting testimony. When their descendants asked, "What do these stones mean?" the people of Israel could recount how God had miraculously stopped the waters of the Jordan, allowing them to cross on dry ground. Joshua chapter 4, verses 6-7. This memorial wasn't just for the current generation, but for every generation that followed. It stood as a reminder of God's covenant promise to give Israel the land and his powerful intervention in their history. Each stone represented not only one of the 12 tribes, but also the unity of the nation under God's leadership. The 12 stones were a tangible connection to the past and the covenant between God and Israel. They represented faith, obedience, and the people's reliance on God for their survival and success in the Promised Land. For every family, the stones were a story of triumph, one that reminded them that their ancestors faced an impossible situation but overcame it through faith. The memorial stones were not hidden or tucked away, but were placed in a prominent location where they could be easily seen. This ensured that the story of the Jordan crossing would not be forgotten. The lesson was clear. Israel's victories and blessings came not from their own strength, but from the power and faithfulness of God. It was a call to remember that the same God who had led them through the wilderness was now leading them into the future. This moment also served as a profound reminder of the importance of teaching future generations about God's works. Joshua knew that the memory of God's miracles must be passed down, and these stones were a tool for storytelling, a reminder that every generation must remember and honor God's faithfulness, never forgetting the power and presence of God in their history. Jericho was the gateway to the Promised Land, strategically positioned in the heart of Canaan. Conquering this city was essential for Israel's campaign to secure the land that God had promised to their ancestors. Jericho was a fortified city with high walls, symbolizing the strength and resistance of the Canaanite nations. The Israelites could not move further into Canaan without first dealing with this formidable obstacle. By defeating Jericho, they would not only gain a strategic advantage, but also send a powerful message to the other cities and nations in Canaan. Israel's God was with them, and his promises would be fulfilled. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1 to 2. God's instructions to Joshua were unconventional. Instead of laying siege to the city or attacking directly, God commanded the Israelites to march around Jericho once a day for 6 days in silence, with only the sound of the priests' trumpets filling the air. On the 7th day, they were to march around the city 7 times, and after the final trumpet blast, the Israelites were to shout with all their might. This divine strategy showed that victory would come not by human strength or military skill, but by faith and obedience to God. Joshua chapter 6, verses 3 to 5. The act of walking in silence around the city also served as a test of faith and discipline for the people, trusting that God's plan would prevail even if it seemed illogical. As the Israelites completed their 7th lap on the 7th day, the priests blew their trumpets, and Joshua gave the command for the people to shout. At that moment, the impenetrable walls of Jericho miraculously collapsed. This supernatural event confirmed that God was actively fighting for Israel. With the walls reduced to rubble, the Israelite soldiers rushed into the city and swiftly defeated its inhabitants, following God's command to destroy everything in the city. Joshua chapter 6, verses 20 to 21. Jericho's fall marked a significant turning point in the conquest of Canaan. However, one household was spared: Rahab and her family. Rahab, a prostitute living in Jericho, had hidden 2 Israelite spies sent by Joshua to scout the city. In return for her help, the spies promised to protect her and her family when the city fell. Rahab's faith in the God of Israel, despite being a Canaanite and an outsider, led to her salvation. She hung a scarlet cord from her window, as instructed by the spies, signaling her home for the Israelite soldiers to spare. Joshua chapter 2, verses 1 to 21. After the battle, Rahab and her family were brought out safely and integrated into the community of Israel, and Rahab later became an ancestor of Jesus Christ. Joshua chapter 6, verses 22 to 25. Matthew chapter 1, verse 5. The destruction of Jericho served a dual purpose. On one hand, it was a military necessity. Jericho's defeat opened the path for the Israelites to move further into Canaan. On the other hand, it was a spiritual statement. Jericho represented the strongholds of the Canaanite nations that had engaged in idolatry and wickedness for centuries. God had decreed that the land of Canaan would be given to Israel, but its inhabitants had to be driven out due to their sin. Leviticus chapter 18, verses 24 to 25. The fall of Jericho was the first of many victories that would prove that God was delivering on his promise to give the Israelites the land. After the battle, Joshua placed a curse on anyone who would attempt to rebuild the city, further emphasizing that Jericho's defeat was a permanent declaration of God's will. Joshua chapter 6, verse 26. The battle was not just about military conquest, it was about fulfilling God's plan for his people and the promised land. The victory over Jericho showed that God's power was greater than any earthly defense, and it reinforced the message that, with faith and obedience, no obstacle was too great for God to overcome. After the triumphant victory at Jericho, Israel's next challenge was the city of Ai. Compared to Jericho, Ai seemed like a much smaller and less fortified city, leading Joshua and his commanders to believe that it would be an easy conquest. Confident from their recent success, Joshua sent only a small contingent of soldiers to attack Ai. However, Israel was unexpectedly defeated, with 36 men losing their lives. Joshua chapter 7, verses 2 to 5. This defeat shocked Joshua and the people, as they had assumed that with God's favor, no city could stand against them. But something had gone wrong, and it left them questioning why they had been overpowered. Joshua sought God for answers, crying out in desperation. God's response was clear. Israel had been defeated because there was sin within the camp. One man, Achan, had violated God's explicit command that all the spoils of Jericho were to be either destroyed or devoted to the Lord. Achan had secretly taken some of the treasure, silver, gold, and a valuable garment, and had hidden them in his tent. Joshua, chapter 7, verses 11 to 12. This act of disobedience broke the covenant between God and Israel, leading to the removal of divine protection. As a result, the entire nation suffered. To restore the covenant and remove the curse, Joshua was commanded to identify the guilty party. After a thorough investigation, Achan was found to be the culprit, and he confessed to his sin. God then ordered that Achan and his entire family be executed for their disobedience. This punishment may seem harsh by today's standards, but it was a reflection of the seriousness with which God viewed covenantal faithfulness during this critical period in Israel's history. Achan's sin wasn't a private matter. It jeopardized the entire community's relationship with God. His punishment served as a warning to all Israel about the gravity of sin, especially when it endangered the collective spiritual and physical safety of the nation. The brutal death of Achan and his family in the valley of Achor, where they were stoned and their belongings burned, Joshua, chapter 7, verses 24 to 26, was a demonstration of how seriously God regarded obedience. This severity was not simply about punishing one man, but it was intended to protect the integrity and purity of the entire nation. Disobedience to God's commands, especially in the early days of establishing Israel in the Promised Land, was a threat to their future. The execution of Achan's family also highlighted the communal nature of sin in the ancient world. An individual's actions had consequences for the entire family, reflecting the close-knit structure of Israelite society. After this act of justice, God's favor was restored, and Joshua led Israel to a second successful battle at Ai. This time, God gave them a brilliant military strategy. Joshua set an ambush behind the city while drawing Ai's soldiers out with a feigned retreat. Once the soldiers of Ai pursued the Israelites, the hidden troops seized the city and set it on fire. The ambush resulted in a total victory, and Ai was utterly destroyed. Joshua chapter 8, verses 1 to 29. The defeat and eventual victory at Ai taught Israel the importance of obedience over presumption. Achan's sin showed that even a single act of disobedience could bring devastating consequences to the entire community. The brutal nature of his punishment reinforced the seriousness of maintaining God's covenant and the need for absolute loyalty to his commands. After the victory at Ai and the restoration of Israel's relationship with God, Joshua knew the importance of renewing the covenant between God and the people. It was not enough to simply win battles. Israel needed to remain spiritually grounded. Joshua led the Israelites to Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, where they performed a solemn and sacred ceremony to reaffirm their commitment to God. Joshua chapter 8, verses 30 to 35. This was a moment to realign themselves with God's laws and blessings, ensuring that their military success was backed by spiritual obedience. Joshua followed the exact instructions given by Moses years earlier. Deuteronomy chapter 27, verses 1 to 8. He built an altar on Mount Ebal using uncut stones, ensuring that no iron tools defiled the altar. This was significant because the altar symbolized the purity of Israel's worship, untouched by human tools, representing that their relationship with God should be unaltered by human manipulation. On this altar, Joshua offered sacrifices, both burnt offerings and peace offerings, demonstrating Israel's dedication and thanksgiving to God for his guidance and victories. After the sacrifices, Joshua inscribed a copy of the law of Moses onto the stones of the altar for all of Israel to see. This act was deeply symbolic, as it made the law visible and accessible to every Israelite, reminding them that their success and their identity as a nation were founded on obedience to God's commandments. The public reading of the law reinforced this message. Joshua read every word of the law aloud, including the blessings and curses associated with obedience and disobedience. Joshua chapter 8, verses 34 to 35. This was a powerful reminder of the consequences of turning away from God. Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim held deep significance for Israel. Half of the tribe stood on Mount Ebal, where the curses were pronounced, while the other half stood on Mount Gerizim, where the blessings were proclaimed. The people's voices rang out in unison, affirming their commitment to the covenant. This public declaration was a reminder that their journey into the Promised Land was not just about military conquest, but about becoming a holy nation set apart for God. By renewing the covenant on Mount Ebal, Joshua reminded the people that their success in the Promised Land depended not on military might, but on their faithfulness to God. This event solidified the connection between Israel's victories and their obedience. It was a reaffirmation that every victory came from God's hand, and it was their covenant relationship with Him that would ensure their future in the land. After the victories at Jericho and Ai, the fear of Israel's military power spread across Canaan. While many kings prepared for battle, the Gibeonites, aware they couldn't defeat Israel in combat, devised a clever plan. They decided to seek peace through deception. Rather than confront Israel directly, they pretended to be travelers from a distant land, knowing that Joshua had been commanded by God to destroy the Canaanite nations, but could make treaties with nations from outside the land. Joshua chapter 9, verses 3 to 6. To execute their plan, the Gibeonites, dressed in ragged clothes, wore worn-out sandals, and carried moldy bread and cracked wineskins. Their entire appearance was designed to convince the Israelites that they had traveled for many days. When they arrived at the Israelite camp, they claimed to have come from a far-off land, far beyond the borders of Canaan. They presented themselves humbly, requesting a treaty of peace, playing on Israel's sympathy and desire for peaceful relations with distant nations. Joshua chapter 9, verses 7 to 13. At first, the Israelites were cautious and suspicious, questioning the Gibeonites about their origin. But the appearance of the Gibeonites and their provisions seemed to confirm their story. Joshua and the leaders of Israel examined the dry, moldy bread and the cracked wineskins and believed their tale. However, the Israelites made a critical mistake. They did not seek guidance from God before making a decision. Trusting their own judgment based on what they saw, Joshua and the elders swore an oath in the name of God, making a peace treaty with the Gibeonites, unaware of the deception. Joshua chapter 9 verse 14. 3 days after the treaty was made, the truth came to light. The Israelites continued their journey and soon arrived near the cities of Gibeon. It was then that they discovered the Gibeonites lived nearby and were not from a distant land as they had claimed. The Gibeonites' true identity became clear when the Israelites saw the proximity of their cities. This revelation sparked outrage among the Israelites, who realized they had been deceived. Joshua and the leaders were faced with a dilemma: break the oath and destroy the Gibeonites, or honor the covenant they had sworn in God's name. Joshua chapter 9, verses 16 to 18. Despite the deception, Joshua understood the seriousness of breaking an oath made before God. He chose to keep the treaty, sparing the Gibeonites from destruction. However, the Gibeonites were punished for their deceit. Joshua decreed that they would become servants, woodcutters and water carriers for the altar of the Lord. This role kept them close to the center of Israel's worship and reminded the Israelites of the consequences of acting without seeking God's wisdom. The Gibeonites' cunning ensured their survival, but it also placed them in lifelong servitude to the Israelites. Joshua chapter 9, verses 19 to 27. The discovery of the Gibeonites' deception was a lesson for Israel. By failing to consult God, they had been misled. Yet even in this mistake, God's mercy prevailed. The treaty was upheld, showing that even errors made in haste could be used by God to teach deeper reliance on Him. From this event, Israel learned the critical importance of always seeking divine guidance, no matter how clear or obvious a situation might seem at first glance. After the treaty between the Israelites and the Gibeonites, neighboring Amorite kings were outraged by Gibeon's alliance with Israel. Gibeon was a powerful and strategically important city in the region of Canaan, and its decision to align with Israel was seen as a betrayal by the Amorite kings. Gibeon's defection posed a significant threat to the balance of power in the region, as it signaled to other cities that Israel was gaining momentum and influence. The 5 Amorite kings, rulers of Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon, saw this alliance as a direct challenge to their authority and control over the land. Joshua chapter 10, verses 1 to 5. Furious and determined to crush Gibeon before Israel's influence spread further, these 5 kings formed a coalition to attack the city. Their goal was to send a message to the rest of Canaan. Anyone who allied with Israel would face destruction. Gibeon, despite its size and military capability, knew it could not withstand such a massive attack alone. Desperate, they sent word to Joshua at Gilgal, pleading for immediate assistance. Although Gibeon had previously deceived Israel into making a treaty, Joshua was bound by his oath to protect them. Without hesitation, Joshua gathered his best warriors and marched through the night to Gibeon's aid. Joshua chapter 10, verses 6 to 9. The Amorite kings underestimated the resolve of Joshua and the power of God on Israel's side. Upon hearing the news, God reassured Joshua, "Do not be afraid of them, for I have given them into your hands. Not one of them will be able to withstand you." Joshua chapter 10, verse 8. Encouraged by this divine promise, Joshua led his army on an exhausting overnight march, covering considerable distance to launch a surprise attack at dawn. The Amorite forces were caught completely off guard, and the battle quickly turned in favor of the Israelites. God was with them, and as the Amorites began to flee, something extraordinary happened. As the enemy retreated, God sent a powerful storm of hailstones, which rained down on the fleeing Amorite soldiers. The hailstones were so devastating that more Amorites were killed by them than by the swords of the Israelites. Joshua chapter 10, verse 11. This supernatural intervention further demonstrated that the victory belonged to God. However, Joshua knew that the day was slipping away, and with nightfall, the remaining Amorite kings could escape. In a bold act of faith, Joshua prayed for the sun and moon to stand still, prolonging the daylight to allow for the complete destruction of the enemy. Miraculously, God answered Joshua's prayer. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky, and daylight extended until the Amorites were thoroughly defeated. Joshua chapter 10, verses 12 to 14. This supernatural event stands as one of the most remarkable miracles in the Bible, showcasing God's willingness to intervene in the natural world for the sake of His people. The extended day allowed Joshua to pursue the Amorite kings, who had taken refuge in a cave. Joshua had the cave sealed, and after the battle, he had the kings brought out and executed, displaying their bodies as a sign of God's judgment. Joshua chapter 10, verses 16 to 26. The defeat of the Amorite coalition was a turning point in Israel's conquest of Canaan. It sent a clear message to the other Canaanite cities. Israel's God was fighting for them, and no alliance or military strategy could stand against His power. The victory was not only a military triumph, but a divine demonstration that with God on their side, Israel's enemies would always fall. After years of intense warfare and miraculous victories, Joshua and the Israelites faced a new challenge, dividing the promised land among the 12 tribes of Israel. This was no simple administrative task. It was the culmination of centuries of God's promises to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, finally being fulfilled. Joshua chapter 11, verse 23. The land of Canaan was not just a place for settlement. It was a divine inheritance, representing God's faithfulness to his covenant. Each tribe's portion was a visible reminder of that promise and their place in God's plan. Joshua, along with Eleazar the priest and the tribal leaders, carried out the division of the land by casting lots. This method symbolized that the decision came from God, not from human planning. The tribe of Levi, however, did not receive a large portion of land like the others. Instead, the Levites were given 48 cities scattered throughout Israel, as they were responsible for the priestly duties and caring for the tabernacle. Joshua chapter 13, verse 33. Their role as spiritual leaders was vital, and their dependence on the other tribes for sustenance through tithes and offerings reflected their unique position in the nation. The division of the land was both practical and spiritual. Larger tribes, like Judah, were given more extensive territories, with Judah's portion in the southern region becoming pivotal in Israel's future. The tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, descendants of Joseph, were allocated significant territories on both sides of the Jordan River. Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh had already received their inheritance east of the Jordan. The distribution of land reflected fairness and God's wisdom, ensuring that each tribe was adequately provided for. Joshua 2 chapters 13 through 19. The importance of these tribal inheritances went beyond geography. They were symbols of God's fulfilled promises. However, the land division did not mean the work was over. While the territory was allocated, many tribes still had to conquer their assigned regions fully. Canaanites remained in many areas, and it was the responsibility of each tribe to drive them out. This required ongoing faith and obedience to God's commands. Joshua's leadership continued to be essential during this process. He reminded the people not to become complacent, but to trust in God's strength to overcome the remaining obstacles. Joshua chapter 18, verse 3. Their success was tied directly to their faithfulness to God's covenant. As Joshua neared the end of his life, he called all of Israel together at Shechem for a final assembly. Here, he recounted the many ways God had been faithful to Israel, from the days of Abraham to their present conquest of the land. Joshua emphasized the importance of continuing to serve God with wholehearted devotion and warned against turning to the false gods that still influence some of the surrounding nations. In a powerful moment, Joshua declared his personal commitment to God. As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Joshua chapter 24, verse 15. This declaration became a lasting example of unwavering faith, leaving behind a legacy of strong leadership and deep trust in God. Joshua's leadership and the division of the land marked a turning point for Israel. The conquest had established them in the land, but maintaining their inheritance required continuous faith and obedience. Through Joshua's guidance, the Israelites were reminded that their strength came not from their military victories, but from their relationship with God. His final words at Shechem and the division of the land symbolized the establishment of a nation dedicated to God, a legacy that would echo throughout Israel's history. As we've seen through the incredible journey of Joshua and the people of Israel, their unwavering faith and obedience to God brought about miraculous victories. This story teaches us that no challenge is too great when we trust in the divine promises. If you enjoyed learning about Joshua's conquest of the Promised Land, don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more impactful biblical stories and lessons. Thank you for being here, and may God bless you.